D-Day, the 6th of June 1944. The greatest military operation in history, as the Allies launched a massive assault on Nazi-occupied France. With Hitler's army on the back foot, this ambitious offensive would lead to the liberation of Europe. But behind the success of D-Day lies a terrible tragedy many had kept secret for years.
Did we get any orders about remaining silent? You bet we did.
A training exercise that turned into a bloody massacre on the South Devon coast.
All I remember about it was the moon just going behind some clouds, and then ever sudden all hell broke loose.
There was a lot of tracer boats going across there, and I said, this is the wrong place to go.
I chose to go out on deck, and 2 people followed me. The rest of them didn't make it.
Over 60 years later, questions remain for the few survivors. And time is running out to find answers. How could a routine exercise end in such bloodshed?
A lot of these people were doing all this for the first time. You don't always get it right the first time.
And does new evidence point to it being an even worse disaster than ever thought? Slapton Sands, a beautiful stretch of South Devon coastline. Today, 68 years later, it bears few scars of the horrors that took place here during the Allied training operation codenamed Exercise Tiger. The ghosts of the tragedy that claimed so many lives seemingly washed away. But one man, local author and retired policeman Richard Bass, is convinced that the full story of the disaster has yet to be revealed. What started as a passing interest has turned into a 15-year quest to uncover the truth.
Exercise Tiger has always been a fascinating subject. I've studied the World War II, the American forces, and quite inevitably came across Exercise Tiger, the disaster in rehearsal for D-Day. From there, I started to investigate, but soon found that there were an awful lot of things that didn't add up.
By 1943, Germany had occupied France, and the Allies were determined to push back the Nazi advance. Plans were underway to mount a counter-invasion of Europe, which would be the largest military assault ever. It would involve over 20,000 airborne troops, joining an amphibious force of over 150,000 Army and Navy personnel, many of them American, as well as almost 7,000 ships to invade the Normandy beaches. It was a dangerous make-or-break operation, to be codenamed Operation Overlord. The date was set for June the 6th, 1944, D-Day. The Allies only had months to plan. Military bosses decided to prepare the troops with a major training exercise, which would be a full-scale rehearsal for the invasion. Slapton Sands provided the perfect location.
Slapton is a nice, out-of-the-way place. It's an area which in 1943 they could relatively easily depopulate by shifting the local civilian population to create a large training area which wouldn't be observed from the surrounding areas, which would give them a degree of privacy. And also, it seems to bear some similarities ultimately to Utah Beach, where they were destined to land on D-Day.
By early 1944, the south of England was swarming with over 1 million American soldiers preparing for the D-Day rehearsals. For most, this was their first taste of foreign soil.
I thought England was like America.
That southern part of England was fabulous. I loved that down there. Right up from Brixham was a place called Torquay, and they said that was the Miami Beach of England.
Well, it was damp.
But the Americans weren't over here to enjoy themselves. They were here for training for the D-Day leap to France, now only weeks away. Few of them had experienced warfare before, and they were about to be thrust into the greatest assault in history alongside their British counterparts.
And it was vitally important that we should have an opportunity of training and exercising together. So Slapton Sands, Exercise Tiger, was going to be a rehearsal for the landings on Utah Beach a few weeks later on the 6th of June.
The plan for Exercise Tiger was split into phases. The pre-assault phase would see Navy ships out at sea bombard the beach at Slapton. This would pave the way for an assault force to arrive in small boats and land on Slapton Sands to secure the beach. At defensive positions behind Slapton Sands, other US soldiers would play the part of defending Germans and fire over the heads of the incoming troops. This would mimic battlefield conditions to be faced in the initial landings on Utah Beach in Normandy. The follow-up phase would see larger ships loaded with men and machinery travel from Plymouth and Brixham to land 24 hours later on the same beach to provide crucial reinforcements. But it was not just the location that was to be as close as possible to the real thing. There was another element too. Although only a rehearsal, everyone would be using live ammunition.
There's an old saying in military terms, train hard in order to fight easy. If you are preparing for combat, you've got to experience as near conditions of combat as is possible. Using live ammunition encourages troops to get used to the danger, get used to the sights and the sounds and the smells and the kind of feeling that actually comes from being in mortal danger.
Almost a week before, men began boarding their ships in preparation for the exercise. Secrecy was vital, not only among the soldiers involved, but also the locals. The entire population of Slapton Sands was evacuated 5 months beforehand. As a result, there would be no civilians to witness the horrors that were to unfold. Within 48 hours, the assault troops on the beaches would be shelled by live ammunition from the guns of their own navy, and the convoys of reinforcements would be attacked by German torpedo boats, leaving many hundreds of men injured, dead, or missing at sea. On the morning of April the 27th, 1944, a convoy of 8 transport ships, part of the follow-up phase, were preparing to leave Plymouth and Brixham. Packed full of American soldiers and machinery, they would head along the South Devon coast towards Slapton Sands as part of Exercise Tiger, the full-scale military rehearsal for the imminent D-Day landings in Normandy. Further up the coast, American assault troops in smaller landing craft were due to land on Slapton Sands at 7:30 a.m. Their mission was to storm the beach, just as they would do on the occupied Normandy coast of France 6 weeks later. Anchored 4 miles offshore were ships of the Royal Navy. To make the exercise as realistic as possible, these ships were to shell the beach for 30 to 40 minutes with live ammunition before they landed. On the ridge above the beach, other American soldiers were positioned to act as German defenders and fire over the heads of the oncoming assault troops once the bombardment had ceased. The use of live ammunition was standard operating procedure, but relied critically on precise timings being adhered to. One of the ships waiting off Slapton with guns ready was HMS Hawkins. Aboard her was 18-year-old midshipman Michael Stacey.
The normal system was that you bombarded until a certain time before HR, and you lifted the fire probably half an hour before. So there was plenty of safety time between the lifting of the bombardment and the landing of the troops.
On April the 27th, H hour was scheduled for 7:30 a.m. This was when the assault troops would land on the beach. After 6:30 a.m., the Royal Navy would begin shelling the beach in advance of these landings to soften up defenses. After half an hour, the bombardment would cease and the beach made safe for the assault to begin. But at 6:20, the man in charge of the exercise, the American Admiral Don P. Moon, received news that some Army landing craft were behind schedule. At 6:25, just 5 minutes before the initial bombardment, and unable to consult senior Army officers, Moon ordered H hour to be delayed by 1 hour. Critically, the decision to postpone H-hour failed to reach some of the assault troops already heading for the beach.
And it was SOP, standard operating practice. Because if you alter the timing of it all, and there's a misunderstanding, then you have got a problem.
The troops on their small landing craft heading for the beach had no idea what they were walking into.
The first tragedy of Exercise Tiger was about to take place.
The postponement of HR, I think, was a terrible tactical mistake. And I don't think Moon understands the tactical implication of what he has decided. Because if you can imagine, I think the thing about an amphibious operation, this is complexity, is that you have so many different elements that come together, and they were operating on an assumption that HR would not be postponed. They were never informed, and particularly, of course, the ships providing the naval gunfire support.
At the newly altered H-hour, Navy guns opened up on what they thought were deserted beaches. But the beaches were far from deserted. The soldiers found themselves being shelled directly by their own Navy guns. They were also having live bullets fired over their heads by US troops on the hills, acting as German defenders.
And these poor soldiers were coming ashore, being shot at by their own soldiers, and also being bombarded by the guns of the Royal Navy offshore.
A lot of these people were doing all this for the first time, you know, and they were in action for the first time. You don't always get it right the first time. And there are stories, some stories which are better not told, but it was a tragedy and there were a lot of casualties as a result of what today is called friendly fire. And by the time daylight arose, and we did carry out our bombardment, but the exercise was to a great extent in disarray.
As confusion and chaos reigned on the beach, 30 miles down the coast, the second phase of Exercise Tiger was underway. The amphibious convoy of 5 transport ships had left Plymouth on its way to join more ships off Brixham. They would then sail into Lyme Bay before landing on Slapton Sands on the morning of April the 28th to reinforce the assault troops who had secured the beach the day before. But the soldiers and sailors had no idea if this was an exercise or indeed D-Day itself. On LST 515 was Floyd Hicks.
We really didn't know what we were doing because that was all a situation whereby nobody knew that we were on a practice run, you know, for the invasion.
The convoy was made up of landing ship tanks, known as LSTs, capable of carrying over 2,000 tons of machinery and hundreds of men. On board, there was little affection for these large, lumbering craft.
You know what LST stands for, don't you? Large Stationary Target.
Well, now that I'm not on it anymore, well, I think it was a very fine ship.
It was good because it was a small crew. It was a friendly crew. And it was like all your brothers was with you. On LST, you knew everybody. Sad part, when people got killed, you knew them too.
A rumor was going around that the LST was so shallow draft that it could not be torpedoed. So I felt safe, even though it turned out to be a big lie. But that's what we were told.
The convoy was due to be at sea with a corvette and destroyer for protection for 22 hours before landing at Slapton at 0730. It was the equivalent to the Channel crossing to France that was scheduled for 6 weeks later, and it was an opportunity to acclimatize the men to being at sea for so long. But even before they sailed, a series of mistakes and blunders had been made that would seal their fate.
It was standard procedure for the escort commanders to meet with the commanders of these types of amphibious craft beforehand, before an exercise, and to establish procedures, and particularly to establish signals frequencies that they could communicate. and this simply didn't happen.
It was a catastrophic blunder. The LSTs, in waters where the enemy was known to attack, were on different radio frequencies from their escorts, and so unable to communicate with the boats there to protect them. Worse still, they watched helplessly as one of the escorts, HMS Scimitar, began heading in the opposite direction, back to Plymouth docks.
Sadly, Scimitar had a collision with another British freighter. It caused some damage to the bows and was ordered to return to Plymouth. This, of course, left just the Azalea to shepherd the LSTs on their journey around Lyme Bay.
That's to have tragic consequences in the circumstance of April 1944.
But not only was the destroyer missing, so was one of the LSTs. 4 of the craft should have sailed from Brixham, but one, LST 508, was damaged and remained in port. LST 508 was scheduled to have 294 men on board, crucial to the exercise. Mystery has surrounded what happened to the men of 508 ever since. As the sun set, the depleted convoy, with its sole escort for protection, continued slowly towards Lyme Bay. But they were not alone for long. 60 miles away in Cherbourg, a fleet of enemy attack boats began its routine patrol. These German boats spent the war scouring the channel for victims, and tonight they set out in search of prey, heading straight for Lyme Bay.
Since 1940, when the Schnell boats had made their first debut in the English Channel, they had gained a reputation as being highly effective ship killers.
E-boats were armed with torpedoes and 20mm guns and capable of 50 knots. The Allied craft were easy targets. Just past midnight, the shore radar operator in Plymouth finally detects hostile E-boats approaching the convoy. The warning broadcast never reached the doomed LSTs. It was sent on the wrong frequency. Minutes later, the E-boats attacked the convoy. Alfred Bronck was on LST 499, the first boat to be targeted.
All I remember about it was the moon just going behind some clouds, and then ever sudden all hell broke loose. There was just fighting and shooting all over the place.
Dale Rodman was on LST 507, the next ship to be attacked.
All of a sudden, I heard a big bang on the side of the ship right adjacent to where I was sleeping. And then whatever it was, I heard it scrape the bottom of the deck, and I knew that it was a torpedo. I suspected it was a U-boat because I didn't know a thing about E-boats.
Initially, the design of the shallow boats saved some of the convoy from damage.
Many of the first salvos, actually, the torpedoes slid underneath the LSTs because the LST is a very shallow draft vessel. The Germans soon quickly realized what had happened, adjusted the torpedoes, and went in for a second attack.
On LST 515, the alert was sounded, and Floyd Hicks took up his position on his 40mm gun.
I told the other guys on the way up there, I said, you know what? I think this is the real thing. We better get going.
But not everyone was convinced. On LST 507, Dale Rodman tried to persuade his colleagues that they were being attacked for real. But most thought it was just a false alarm.
Rosiak, who was the corporal in charge, he said, I'm not going out there for another false alarm in the middle of the night and lose some sleep. And nobody has to go unless they want to. I tried to convince them all that they were making a mistake. If I was right, they're all dead, and if I was wrong, I lost an hour. So I chose to go out on deck, and 2 people followed me. Two others followed me. The rest of them didn't make it.
Having adjusted their torpedoes, the E-boats made another attack on Dale's boat. This time, the E-boat scored a direct hit.
It was confusion. Everybody trying to fight the fire and lower the lifeboats, and there was no communication. nobody knew what to do. Finally, I just decided it looked like it was time for me to leave the ship.
LST-507 was sinking, but the E-boats weren't finished.
I saw a couple of E-boats pass between us and another ship that was on fire. And so I could see them going across, but there wasn't really anything to do.
I remember us radioing for help because we were being attacked, and they said by the time they got unmoored from the dock, those E-boats would be back in Cherbourg, so there wasn't anything they could do.
By now, LST-531 had taken a direct hit, spilling its men and machinery into the fiery waters. 531 began sinking like 507, taking hundreds of men with her. Next to be attacked was LST-289, with Earl Thatcher on board.
First of all, I started to go across the main deck. And I remember there was a lot of tracer bullets going across there, and I said, this is the wrong place to go. There was one gunner's mate that evidently he's seen the torpedo coming, and he tried shooting it with a 50mm gun, and he got killed.
LST-289 was torpedoed at the stern, but Earl wasn't even aware they'd been hit.
The only thing that I knew that I found out later, because I was cold, I went to go down to my locker and it was gone. In fact, the whole back end of the ship was gone.
With 2 LSTs sunk and 1 damaged, the E-boats retreated to Cherbourg. The 6 surviving LSTs scattered and headed for shore. And as dawn broke over Slapton, the horror of the catastrophe became evident. Over 24 hours, hundreds of men had been lost at sea. As the horror began to sink in, the questions began to be asked. How could a routine training exercise have led to such a tragedy? Dawn broke over Slapton Sands on April 28, 1944, to reveal the worst training disaster to befall American troops in the run-up to D-Day. Hundreds of US soldiers and sailors had died in a rehearsal for the invasion of Europe, when German E-boats infiltrated a convoy of transport ships, taking men and machinery to rehearse landings on Slapton Sands. The convoy set sail with only the corvette HMS Azalea providing an escort. Its other escort, the destroyer HMS Scimitar, remained in port, damaged and unable to sail. It was a crucial factor in allowing the E-boats to attack, as identified in official post-action debriefs. But a flotilla of British motor torpedo boats, stationed a few miles up the coast, were in harbour and prepared to counter the E-boat threat, yet they were never called out. On board was RNVR officer Ewan Strathcona. He remains puzzled why they remained in harbour.
We first heard about the attack by the E-boats. We were the 4 of us were on standby in Portland, and about 2 o'clock in the morning, we were called to instant readiness, and we started up and were then told to shut down. And it happened again at about 4 o'clock. And then finally, around dawn, we were sent out to pick up survivors, only, I'm sorry to say, to find that they were all dead. Our overriding memory, once we realized that all these people were dead, was frustration and shame and anger, really, that we hadn't been allowed to stop it happening.
So why weren't the motor torpedo boats ever sent out? They could have been on the scene in less than 30 minutes, provided some protection, and rescued some of those in the water.
The only reason I can think that we weren't sent out at 2 o'clock was that the people who were controlling the movement might have been worried that we would end up fighting each other, which was always a serious problem on these occasions. But we became aware that there had been an E-boat attack, And our job was to prevent E-boat attacks, and we were very upset that we hadn't been involved.
Hundreds of men had been killed or were missing, and those fortunate enough to survive were immediately sworn to secrecy.
They just said not to talk about it. That's all. Some people say they were threatened with court-martial. I don't recall that, but we were cautioned not to speak about it ever.
They told us that we'd get dishonorably discharged if we start talking about it. That was it.
Did we get any orders about remaining silent? You bet we did. The moment we arrived, to our astonishment, we were told not to mention anything we had seen on condition of instant court-martial if we did.
Secrecy was vital at the time for operational reasons. The Germans were expecting the D-Day invasion to take place at Calais, and the Allies couldn't risk them discovering the landings were planned for Normandy. It was also essential to preserve morale amongst the troops, as well as a population weary from war. But author Richard Bass believes there may be another reason the full facts have never come to light. The records since 1944 have suggested a total of 749 men died during Exercise Tiger. Men such as Lawrence Muir from Missouri, Robert Grissom from Tennessee, and Joe Rosiek from Way, Michigan, who made the fatal decision not to follow Dale Rodman out of their doomed LST. But Richard believes many more soldiers and sailors may have lost their lives during the exercise, and he is determined to fight for recognition for these missing dead.
749 men were officially killed during Exercise Tiger. I am utterly convinced there are many more casualties of this exercise, and I intend to get to the bottom of this.
The figure of 749 comes from a report hastily written just 24 hours after the disaster by Admiral Moon to the Supreme Headquarters Allied Expeditionary Force.
This was sent to Schaefer from Admiral Moon, and it is simple mathematics. He lists here the LSTs 507, 531 that had 1,026 men aboard. From that, there were 290 survivors, and simple mathematics, if you subtract one from the other, add the 13 from casualties from LST 289, and you arrive at a figure of 749.
But Richard thinks this figure does not account for all the men lost on the convoy of LSTs. His first lead has to do with LST 508, the ship that never sailed.
It was due to load of Brixham, exactly the same as LST 507. And I think it makes sense that the load that was due to go on to 508, which simply could not sail now, was probably put onto 507. The two ships would have been side by side at the same port. The men due to go on 508 were already there, and it would have made sense to just put them straight onto 507.
There were 294 soldiers due to sail on 508. If they were put on 507 and went down with the ship, then the death toll could be higher. Dale Rodman is the final survivor of 507, and he's in no doubt.
It was early morning. We came into the dock and lined up to get ready to board the LST, and then all of a sudden everything stopped, and there was a bunch of commotion going on. And the lieutenant that he came up, he said, "We cannot use the pre-prepared list because there are many more of you aboard here than we expected." And the number of people on there was over 500 people on board.
Admiral Moon himself, in his official debrief, states they were putting 400 to 500 men on each LST. But no other official documents can shed any light on LST 508. Could its load of men really have been transferred to 507 without any records?
I am convinced that when 508 it couldn't sail because it was damaged, there was doubling up. Now this, of course, happened at the last minute, and this is where the real tragedy starts to unfold, because did all the troops who were originally going to get on board 508, they were transferred to 507, but was there a new manifest or loading plan drawn up, or at the last minute where they just put on 507. I doubt very much whether there was the time, or whether the staffs would have done to have drawn up a new manifest or loading plan for 507, which would have included the expanded numbers that it had on board from 508.
This is the last known photo of LST-507, taken the day before it was sunk. It was already loaded for the exercise with men and machines, but it's impossible to tell from this photo if it's overloaded with soldiers. If Richard wants to find out if 507 was overloaded, then there's only one place left to look. LSTs 507 and 531 still lie at the bottom of Lyme Bay.
Well, if you can get in there, that'd be brilliant.
Richard wants to see if they hold any clues to the mystery of double loading.
On this dive trip, what I'm hoping we're going to find are the two LSTs, 531 and 507, that were sunk by the German E-boats. On 507, I'm specifically looking for jeeps. On the manifest, there were supposed to be 2 jeeps on 507. If we find more than 2 jeeps, then it will certainly prove that part of 508's load went on to 507.
But this will be no easy task. The wrecks are in deep water, and the dive team's remotely operated camera will have to penetrate the dark as well as navigate discarded fishing nets. At 54 meters, the remote camera hits the seabed and confirms the team's worst fears. The visibility is poor. It'll be difficult to find the ship in these conditions, let alone jeeps.
Yeah. No, that's something right ahead of us there. There you go.
But despite the gloom, something looms into view.
Yeah, that's her.
Parts of an LST can just be made out.
It's like a porthole or something, yeah.
They found the wreck of one of the LSTs. The task now is to make out the remains of the vehicles.
So that's, yeah, we're right on it. That's one of the portholes. That is a porthole.
After 15 hours, the bad weather conditions and poor visibility are too great. And reluctantly, the dive has to be abandoned. Richard is determined not to give up.
Over the wreck sites, it was a very poignant feeling. It was quite an emotional feeling, and a feeling I've never had before, except perhaps in war cemeteries. It was that sort of emotion. I felt very humbled by the fact that I was actually there and couldn't and didn't want to imagine the horrors that went on there so long ago.
Most of those killed during Exercise Tiger were Americans. His only option is to travel to the United States, where he hopes to find answers. At Arlington National Cemetery, home to America's war dead, a memorial to Exercise Tiger was erected in 1995. But the plaque conflicts with the officially accepted figure. It commemorates 639 American and Army Navy personnel who died in the tragedy, over 100 fewer than the officially recognized 749. Dale Rodman has been researching the Exercise Tiger story for many years. Dale says he approached the American Battle Monuments Commission, who honored the sacrifice of US troops, and asked for a full account of the men who lost their lives in the exercise. Dale claims the reply he received 20 years ago, titled Exercise Tiger Personnel Accounting, details men listed as dead, missing or rescued, and where their bodies are buried. It suggests 1,405 dead and missing.
Well, that's hugely different to 749.
Mm-hmm.
But some of the details are missing.
What does he mean here by unspecified?
Well, he didn't want to tell who it was.
Who do you think it was?
Who do I think it was? Well, I think Part of it was the 4th Division, okay, the 4th Medical Battalion, 4th Quartermaster Battalion, and the 8th Infantry Regiment.
And yet, the American Battle Monuments Commission show nobody killed or missing on those dates.
No, they do not. No, none of those from those units.
The document sent to Dale appears to add further confusion around the numbers of missing or dead, with figures ranging from 639 to 1,405. What is the true figure? Richard tries to get a meeting with the American Battle Monuments Commission. They say they are not the authority for military casualty statistics and direct him to the American Center for Military History. But in an email, they say they cannot comment on the purpose or basis of a letter written by a former ABMC employee 20 years ago. Richard has better luck with the American Navy and is granted an interview with Tim Frank of the US Navy History and Heritage Command. He wants to ask him about the possibility that men from LST 508, which didn't sail in the convoy, were loaded onto its sister ship, LST 507. If double the number of men were on the ship when she was sunk, the death toll could be higher.
I couldn't find anything in our records that happened. The only mention of 508 that I found in our records was that it didn't leave on schedule. But as to what happened to the crew and the equipment, I couldn't find anything in our records.
But is it even possible to put a complement of almost 300 additional soldiers onto an already packed LST 507?
As for these particular operations, I can't really say whether they added more troops, but if you look at the ships transporting GIs back from Europe at the end of the war, they were just jam-packed with troops. So, but obviously that wasn't for an invasion.
Richard knows that as with all military deaths, it's vital for families to know the circumstances in which their loved ones died. With Exercise Tiger, it seems there is still uncertainty.
If you look at just modern day examples, you know, look at September 11th or Hurricane Katrina or the tsunami. Initial reports, the numbers were just, you know, thousands and thousands and thousands of people. And then as time went on, the number then is brought down to the more accurate number. And these were the days before cell phones and computers and satellites. So even today, with all the technology, we don't always get the numbers right.
Author Richard Bass has returned from the US with few answers to his questions. The official number of those who lost their lives on Exercise Tiger remains 749. Yet Richard has discovered figures ranging from 639 to 1,405. So what is the truth? In the course of his research, Richard has uncovered 2 letters. They seem to be from men, now dead, who were eyewitnesses to the assault on Slapton Sands. Troops landing on the beaches were shelled by their own ships as a result of a communication breakdown. Yet there is no official record of anyone being killed in this phase of Exercise Tiger. In one of the letters is the following account.
I saw approximately 200 or more fatal casualties, some scattered on the beach and some piled in trucks. I saw 6x6 trucks, tarp covered and with tarp curtains in the rear, being loaded with fatal casualties.
The other letter claims to be from a general's chauffeur, and he refers to a lucky escape.
I was at Slapton Sands. Every ship had its share of rehearsal. I drove the general to inspect the exercise that day. I let him out, then I parked the Jeep near the top of Villagers Hill. I had a real view to the rehearsals, live ammunition, looking out to sea. These were too close to hitting me, so I left 3 soldiers. 5 minutes after going, the shell killed all 3.
Richard wants to find out if men were indeed killed on the beaches. He contacts the American Center of Military History. They are unable to confirm the 200 casualties, commenting, we cannot account for any casualties that may have been incurred ashore in the days that followed, which your sources attribute to friendly fire. But they do suggest something new. Although the large number cited are doubtful, isolated cases of training accidents may well have happened. And what is even more revealing about their response is that the figure of 749 killed during Exercise Tiger are solely Army casualty figures. Casualties to ships' crews, beachmaster units, Navy demolition teams, and others involved in the exercise but not listed in Army sources could well raise that number.
This email says that it's 749 Army casualties from Exercise Tiger. 749, just Army casualties. But I have documents here that prove there were at least 198 Navy casualties from the same exercise.
Richard has obtained copies of the official after-action reports compiled on May 2nd, 1944. Written as official reports into the exercise by the Navy, they state quite clearly that 13 Navy men were lost on LST-289. LST-507 had 71 killed or missing, and LST-531, 114 killed or missing, making an additional 198 Navy casualties.
This makes a total of 947. 947. This disproves the 749 that for decades has been accepted as the true casualty figure for Exercise Tiger. 947 is just what can be proved. But who knows, that figure of 947 could be much, much higher.
In the same email, they do insist that no attempt has been made to either cover up the events, somehow hide the facts, or to minimize the casualties. But they have not given Richard a new total for the number of men who lost their lives. Richard feels vindicated by the response. For him, it's final confirmation that the scale of the disaster was far greater than the official figures acknowledge. But for the survivors, one last question remains harder to answer. Did any good come from the tragedy? And were lessons learned from Tiger that made D-Day the success it was?
I sure hope so. I don't know. But I sure hope that it did.
That you'll have to get somebody a lot smarter than me to answer. I don't know. To me, any sacrifice of life is not worth it. Tough thing.
The question of can it be justified, I think in terms of, if you use the word justified, I think I would say, no, there were so many cock-ups that it needn't have happened. If you summarize the whole thing, they learned lessons which saved a lot of lives later. My question would be, did you have to have 700 lives sacrificed to discover that?